to the Polgar Chess University. This lesson will be a lot of fun and of course instructional at the same time. I'll share with you some of the most amazing endgame studies that Troitsky has composed back in the 1920s and 30s. All of them will focus on skewers and discoveries. Let's start with the very first one, and we'll only see the kind of end of the composition because the full composition may be too complex, and it's important to understand the idea before we'll build on it in a more complex form. Well, the position we see in front of us right now, white has a rook and bishop versus black having a rook and pawn. Generally, endgames, rook and bishop versus rook, even without that black pawn on h6, are considered a draw, unless it's a special situation. In this case, however, that very pawn that black has on h6 is actually costing him the game. We can see that the rook from h1 does not have any reasonable move at the moment. You may say, but why would it need to have? It is white's turn, not black's. Moreover, the black king can move as well, or the pawn. Well, all that seems to be true as well. However, amazingly, white can put black in a zugzwang situation, which is pretty amazing given the material we have on the board. White played rook to b1. Look at this beautiful situation. The black rook still cannot move. If the black king moves, then all of a sudden the king will position itself on a dark square. And that's all white was waiting for. So that bishop from g1 that is pinned could move away by giving a check. So either king a5 followed by bishop b6 check, or king a3 followed by bishop c5 check will result in a discovered attack and the win of the black rook in the corner. But how about if black instead advances the pawn with a check moreover? Well, white needs to be careful where to go, making sure that the black rook does not get out of the corner, and therefore the king simply just moves to g3. Now, if the black rook moves, again it will be captured, or if the pawn moves, the rook will be trapped right in the corner. A pretty amazing endgame, isn't it? Let's move on and see the next example. Here we go. From this position on, all the endgames will involve queens. Again, it's a situation where black has an extra pawn. So normally speaking, even if black would lose the knight on e1 and white could maintain the bishop on g7, it should be a draw. Typically, just to have an extra piece, a bishop or knight, whether just with the king, or just with the queen, or just with the rook, typically one piece advantage is not sufficient to win if you do not have any pawns in addition which possibly could promote in the future. So in this situation, we'll need to look for possibilities on how to create a skewer. In this situation, we can already see the outline of it in that the black king and queen are lined up on the same diagonal. And we have a piece that can move and attack diagonally, and that is the queen. Of course, the bishop can as well, but the bishop is running on the dark squares, so not in this position. Now, it seems that white could immediately create a skewer, and end of story. However, not so simple, because in that case, the black knight would have the opportunity to block the check and fully defend against the attack. So therefore the question comes, what should white do? if queen b1 doesn't do the job. Well, what white needs to do is to try to get into a situation where black cannot save his queen. For example, if the black king would be on f5 right now, that would be one of those situations, because then after the white queen goes back and checks the black king and the black knight blocks, then the black knight will be just captured because the black king would not protect it. However, in this case, white needs to combine that idea with another idea of discovery, similarly as we saw in the first example. So white continued by playing queen b7, and if now the king remains on that diagonal by moving to d3 or f5, in either case the queen checks, and if the black knight blocks, that will be just simply captured. On the other hand, if the black king moves to one of the dark squares, again we can see the setup of discovery along the 7th rank, and the white bishop will be ready to jump, sacrifice itself in order for then, if king captures bishop, white queen will capture the black queen. It's important to point out that to try to do the same idea from the other side, from h6, check, would not work because the black king would not be forced to capture that bishop, but would have the opportunity to capture it with the queen. And then all of a sudden, white's tricks are over. So, as a conclusion in this position, after queen b7 check, black cannot avoid losing his queen. Let's move on to the next example, where all we have is queen bishop versus queen. As I mentioned, under normal circumstances, for example, if it were black's turn right now, the game should end with a draw, and black should start giving checks, and because of the limitation of pieces on the board left, the white king could not avoid the constant checks or would need to exchange the queens, which would result in an automatic draw. Here again the point is to create a successful discovery. The first step in that direction is to play queen to e6, check. So now we're creating the two things that we need. On one hand, the pattern for discovery. On the other hand, making sure to force the black king onto a dark square. Once the king steps out and moves to a dark square, the bishop is ready to give a check, whether on c5 or even more accurate on f6. But the most important thing is that it's a check, and after the black king moves out, just queen takes queen on e8. The same would happen if the black king would move to the other side, then the bishop checks from the other side, and then again after king moves, queen takes queen, and black is lost. Let's move on to the next situation, which has, of course, a lot of similarities to the ones we saw so far. In this case, white will combine the idea of a discovered attack with the ultimate, the checkmate. And here again, the queen needs to try to position itself by giving constant checks and not giving black the time to get out of the bind, as well as creating checkmate threats. White started out by playing queen e6 check. Now, if the king moves to d8, it will be game over quickly with queen d7 checkmate. So the king ultimately has only one choice, moving to f8. And now, just like in the last example, we create a discovery. Queen moves to f6, and doesn't matter in which direction the black king goes, bishop checks, and the queen on f1 is falling. Let's see the next example. Here we go. In this endgame, black has 3 pawns against white's extra bishop. However, the problem is that the black queen again is on an unprotected square, so all what white would need to do is to check with the bishop, and then the queen would be falling. But how can white check with the bishop if the black king is on a light square? Well, it certainly cannot immediately. However, there is a simple and effective way to force the black king onto a dark square, so the white bishop will be able to check. Now, even though it seems that queen e8 accomplishes just that, it doesn't quite work, because then after king c7, white still cannot check with the bishop. So therefore, the correct solution is to check with queen b7. This, on the other hand, gives only one choice for black, and that is to move king to d8. And now, voila, we're ready. Bishop f6 check, followed by queen takes queen. Okay, now we'll move on to a bit more complex situations. Here we are. Right now, black is up 3 pawns, and white doesn't even have the bishop. What's gonna be? Well, white certainly must act quickly and forcefully. Otherwise, black will have a chance to get his own queen into the action and away from any potential skewer or other trouble. I suggest you take a little bit of time and try to figure out a way how to force the black king onto the same diagonal with black's queen. Then come back, listen to the solution, and see if you found it right. The first correct check is to move queen to f7. Now the black king has 4 options where to go. 2 of them lose right away for the same reason. If black willingly immediately steps onto that same diagonal where the black queen is parked, then immediately queen a7 and the black queen is gone. But black can try to do better, and that is move with the king to c6. By the way, also moving to d6 wouldn't help, because then the check would come from d7, which would in turn force the king to c5, and again the same idea, skewer with queen a7 wins black's queen. Okay, let's go back again and see the main line. What happens after black's best defense, which is king to c6. Now the king and the queen are still not on the same diagonal. However, sadly for black, they cannot prolong it much longer before that will happen, assuming that white is giving the correct check right now, which is queen b7. Now, if the king moves to c5, white achieves the goal, queen a7, or if king d6, then comes queen d7, and now, at last, black has no option but to move on to that a7 g1 diagonal, allowing queen a7 and winning black's queen. I hope that through all of these examples, you will develop a sense that when you see a queen in a distance on an unprotected square, you should try to see if there is a way to force the king onto that same diagonal, so you can create a skewer or discovery in some other cases. Let's see the next example. Here we go. Things look pretty good for black. Black has an extra bishop and an extra pawn. However, sometimes the first sight may be deceiving. In reality, if it is white's turn right now, white can win black's queen. There is a way to force the black king onto the same file or diagonal with the black queen. Again, I suggest you try to work it out on your own first, before you look what the correct answer is. And white proceeds with queen e4. If king moves to c3, white would have already achieved the goal, forcing the two most important pieces, the king and the queen, onto the same diagonal. For example, king c3, queen e5. But how about if the king moves rather to d2? Well, then the skewer comes from a different direction. White will play queen e3, leaving black only with one choice, and that is king d1. And now, not on the diagonal, but along the first rank, white is ready to check and skewer. The black queen is gone. Another real nice endgame. And here is another scenario where black again seems to be much ahead. And again, what's common in all of these examples is that the black queen happens to be on an unprotected square, and white is succeeding in forcing the king onto that very same file or diagonal, where, after a skewer check, the queen is lost. So right now, the first correct check that's needed is queen d4. It's always important to assume that your opponent will find the best move that you can see. Only so you can try to get to make the objectively correct moves. Now, if the black king moves right away to e6, white would achieve the goal immediately after playing queen g4. But what if black instead moves the king to f5? Well, then white can accomplish again that same goal by playing queen f4, and now it's not black's choice anymore. The king will have to remain on the diagonal with the queen, and then comes queen g4, check, with on the next move queen captures queen. Let's move on. In our next example, black is again having an extra piece, but this time it's the knight. Well, it doesn't matter much. White's goal again is the same. The black queen is on an unprotected square, and we would like to see the black king on that same diagonal. Now, just for imagination purposes, if the black king right now would be on e3, where would you like to see your queen? Well, if the black king is on e3 and not on e4, we would like to see the white queen on g5 or h6. Well, the queen is already positioned to go to g5, so black certainly needs to be careful. If we're imagining the black king moving to f4, then we'd like to see our queen on h6, accomplishing the same. Well, with all that being said, we know what we want. That's the first step. To imagine something, what we want, then the second step is to see if and how can we make that happen. And I can tell you, in this particular case, white can certainly make it happen. The only question is, how? White plays queen d5. Now, the black king only has two choices. If the king moves to e3, black can play the above-mentioned queen g5 check, and black will lose the queen. On the other hand, if the king moves to f4, then white needs to play very accurately, making sure the black king doesn't run away or the queen doesn't get a moment to start giving checks. And another forceful move, queen f5, limiting black only to one choice, moving the king to e3, and now we achieved our goal, queen g5, and then the queen is lost. Let's move on and see the next example. Here we go. In this case, white does have an extra bishop, although black has two extra pawns as compensation. Again, the question is, how can we force that black king onto the same rank, file, or diagonal with black's queen? And the correct answer here is playing queen f5. If king moves to c4, we achieve the goal, queen e6 or queen f7, and white wins. If black captures the white bishop right away, then queen f2, and again black loses the queen. So there is only one option left, and that is moving the king to e2. And now, because white still has the bishop on d2, queen f2 doesn't achieve the goal. White needs to play finer. The correct move right now is queen f3, giving black no choice but to capture the bishop on d2. And now white again is ready for the skewer. Queen f2 or queen g2 didn't really matter, and black's queen is lost. And the next example, black is up 2 pawns. However, if they lose the queen, they'll end up losing the game too. Here it's a bit hard to imagine how can white force the black king and queen onto the same file or diagonal. Obviously, we have no power over the black queen. It will stay where it is, but we can try to push the black king around by a few well-placed checks. So therefore, we know that the king is the one likely to move, not the queen. We would like to see the black queen on the dark squares. And therefore, white continued with queen c8, only one option for black, king d6, queen c6, again, black has only one choice by playing king e5, and after queen c5, we achieved the skewer that we were looking for. And finally, here is our very last example for this lesson, where black has an extra bishop and an extra pawn. So that's a quite significant material advantage. Not, on the other hand, if white succeeds to win black's queen. And white can and should and did achieve that by playing queen f7. If the king moves to e5, queen g7 wins black's queen immediately. But how about if the king moves to d6? Well, then queen d7, and now if the king goes to e5, then again queen g7 wins the queen, or if the king moves to c5, then queen a7, and again black cannot hang on to the queen much longer. Going back to the beginning position, it's important to point out that if instead white would play queen to g6, that would not work because the black queen would get the opportunity to block the check and save black from trouble. I hope after following all these 12 examples on the same theme on either forcing black into a discovery trouble or a skewer, you'll have a much better chance in finding similar situations in your own games. And of course, don't forget, it works both ways. It's A, you want to make sure you find these opportunities for yourself, and B, not less importantly, you want to make sure you don't fall into one of your opponent's traps. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye until next week.